for joining us today. This is our fourth in a series of 8 public lectures with T-Space within the framework of its architecture residency program. I am Irini Tsahrelia. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, currently instructing and directing the architecture residency program for T-Space. And with me is Maxwell Fang, also an architect and the residency administrator. Hello, Max. Our residents are also joining us here on the panel. They will be leading the conversation and the Q&A session today. I have here, I'll start from the left to the right as I see you, Reggie Mays, Megan Pisarczyk, Jack Awathu, Brian Hartman, Alexander Kern, and Yolande Wen. Hello, it's great to have you here. Our residents are young professionals and students in the field of art and architecture with backgrounds in music and philosophy, among others. And they have joined the residency program to experiment with design and push the boundary on critical thinking. The residency program was introduced 5 years ago. It's an annual program, a 25-day intensive, which takes place every July. And the prompt and the theme for our studio this year is called Transformation of Consciousness. I'm especially grateful for our residents today, this year, to be able to receive partial and full scholarships, thanks to very generous support by Steve Pullimont, Sylvan Engineers, the Al-Held Foundation, and the Art of Building in Rhinebeck. We certainly want to keep the residency scholarships program, and your support is very welcome, so that our programming can be available and accessible by all. For those of you who are new, T-Space is a non-profit organization. It's an initiative of the Stephen Maron Hall Foundation, and it focuses on arts, education, design, and ecology. In addition to the program, the architecture residency program that I just introduced, T-Space offers events called the Synthesis of the Arts events at the intersection of art, poetry, music, and art and architecture. And our first Synthesis of the Arts event for 2021 is coming up this Saturday. It's called Raptures and Reconciliations by Anthony Titus, with music by Anthony Braxton and poetry by Kathy Arcon. We're very excited about the event, and we certainly invite and welcome you to join us. You will see in the chat all links that you need to register for the event. Most of our programming this year, same as last year, is taking place virtually, but I'm very pleased to announce that the gallery, T-Space Gallery, will open its door for in-person visits by appointment only every Sunday, starting this weekend all the way to the end of September. Again, you'll see the chat information if you like to book an appointment or make any reservations to visit us. You can also join our mailing list. And I would also like to ask you to consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, which is where all the recordings become available for our lectures and events. It's an incredible resource. We'll put that link into the chat for you as well. With that, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Martin Stigsgaard, who is joining us from New York. Martin Stigsgaard is the founder of Studio Stixgard and the co-founder of New Weather Group. He is a professor at Switzer School of Architecture, and he has previously taught at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Denmark. Studio Stixgard was established by Martin over 10 years ago as a catalyst for explorations and commentaries on contemporary society. The work is situated within the fields of architecture, urbanism, excellent design, art, and research that often ventures into areas with a charged political terrain. Studio Stixgard has designed residencies in the US and abroad, as well as exhibition designs for Red Bull Arts, for MoMA PS1, and Cleveland Sculpture Center. The character and the typology of the work spans solving indigenous territories, restorative justice design, a manifesto for future cities, to current design collaboration for forthcoming Vietnam War Museum at the Texas Tech University. Martin's lecture is titled Country X, Not Equal City X, Sovereign Territory and Future Cities. Martin, it is really great to have you here. We're very excited to hear from you. Martin's lecture will be approximately 35 to 40 minutes, followed by Q&A, approximately 15 minutes as well. So the overall duration should be about an hour. Our panelists will lead the Q&A. The audience is free to ask questions throughout the entire duration of the event using either the chat or the Q&A function. And with that, welcome everyone. Thank you, Martin, for being here.
Thank you so much, Irene, and thank you so much to T-Space. I'm a big fan of T-Space and have been involved for the last few years. I think it's a wonderful program, and I'm excited to share a talk with you today. So I'm going to just initially share some images here. I assume you can see them. Yeah. So the lecture today is basically about two topics that I've investigated over the last approximately 20 years. Somehow, during the pandemic, they both came to fruition in a certain way. Country X, which is the first project I will talk about, and the more lengthy part of this conversation, is my 20-year investigation and collaboration with indigenous communities, both in South, Central, and North America. Over the years, I have stayed with tribes in the Amazon jungle, and I've visited the Embera people in Panama, and I've tracked on Mayan trails in southern Mexico and Guatemala. The next part of the chat will be City X, which I'll rewrap later on here. So I think that we all know about the protests that the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2018 accumulated. There was quite a bit of publicity about this, and something that made me think that I had only, at that point, pretty much visited indigenous communities in South and Central America. And last summer, at the end of the pandemic, we also were exposed to the protests for, Floyd's being killed and all the Black Lives Matter. So that created momentum in New York City. So I started to begin to recap my thoughts about indigenous population in North America, and going through quick history of the colonization of the American territory. We can see from the lower right corner, the beginning of the United States, which was all, of course, indigenous, and then today, 2020. But last summer, Supreme Court came up with a decision that essentially gave more than half the territory of Oklahoma to indigenous people. This was a huge win for natives in America. And I think that there is a certain momentum for maybe a way of giving more back to indigenous people. My thought was, how do I engage with indigenous people? Like, it's not like you call a tourist office or something like that. So I began to figure out who were in my backyard. So I found out that there was a nation called the Tuscarora Nation, which is about 8 hours from New York City, up by Niagara Falls. So they are part of what's called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also called the Iroquois. They're the Six Nations, and located up close to the border of Canada. So and very close to Niagara Falls. So I drove up there. It's basically located within 15 minutes from Niagara Falls, which is the largest freshwater body of water in North America. What I quickly found out visiting the reservation and sort of investigating it from aerial views, that part of the reservation seemed to be chopped up. And doing a little research, I found out that this built reservoir was actually stolen land from the Tuscarora in 1960. So basically, Robert Moses, when he had great plans for New York City and so forth, he also had great plans for the indigenous people up there. So he, in 1960, stole land from them to create an energy reservoir and a dam project. There was a lot of protest even back then. And I began to think, okay, what can we sort of do in our research? I did this with several students from City College over the last whole year here. So in the historic research, you could see that the dam really affected a lot of the area. This is the dam project up there. What I also realized is a very unusual condition is that the people on Tuscarora Reservation, it's about 1,500 people, do not have any running water. And they're right next to this massive water reservoir. So there are water drives where they would basically announce that here, we have water for the people who don't have enough money to buy. So they would drive in water for this. Part of the problem was that with the dam project, all the normal water flow, watershed going through their lands became polluted. So it's all, they have about 30 wells, something, they're all polluted. So they can't do it. So I drove up there 8 hours, didn't know who to meet with. I didn't know how to engage with this. And along the border of the reservation is a gas station. A lot of the reservations in America have, tax-free gas and tax-free cigarettes. So I went into this trading post here and asked around if there's anybody I could chat with. A part of, how I both work with architecture and also teaching is that I feel it's very important to engage on a sort of empathetic level with the people who you are actually working for. So in this case, I needed to meet a Tuscarora. So I did meet a guy in there, and we had a long conversation. And he told me that after about half an hour or so forth, that they had built a new longhouse. I had investigated a longhouse. A longhouse is not just a longhouse. It's sort of the essence of the whole philosophy of the Iroquois, the Six Nations. So it's a belief system that also is articulated in architecture. So I drove out to the reservation doing my first mistakes here. You do mistakes sometimes when you do research. So I basically drove from here out along this road here, and it was supposed to be somewhere here. I couldn't find it, so I continued up to this berm here. And I parked my car here and I woke up in the berm. I couldn't find the longhouse. As I was standing up here, I was looking over the reservoir, and this very handsome indigenous guy came up the hill. He was huffing and puffing. He had just had a heart surgery, he told me later, but I walked over to him and engaged with him and said, presented myself as a professor, and I'm doing this research. And he was a little bit standoffish, but he was polite. And he told me that he would come up here once a week and he would look over the reservoir. And sometimes when the reservoir was sort of half empty, he would see a tree trunk sticking out of the middle of the reservoir. And that's where his childhood home used to be. So I asked him again about the longhouse, and he gave me a bit more information where to find it. So I drove back on this road here, and I eventually found it. It was hidden in between very, very forested area, and I got out of the car and I walked toward this thing here. Somehow, as I approached this actually very sort of almost modern building, beautiful sort of clean, geometries, I see out of my right eye a big pit bull charging me. And I'm like, okay, this is not good. And there's a guy with a mohawk behind, and he doesn't look very friendly. So I'm thinking, okay, what is the best defense here? I said that maybe it's a friendly offense. So I walked straight toward him and, wave to him and say, what a beautiful longhouse. I'm an architect. This is amazing. And he was a little, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm admiring your longhouse. Did you build it? I said, yeah, I built it. I was part of the building, And then I presented myself, and then he said to me, I know all about you. I said, what do you mean you know about me? So he took up his phone and he said, and he showed me pictures of me over the last hour. So basically on the reservation, they had all been tracking me, all my steps. So they have their own security system. So I realized the consequences of sovereign territory. It's not a joke. This is their land, and I was an intruder. So this was my first mistake, and I apologize profusely. I'm very sorry. No harm. I'm just interested in engaging with this. And then he said, you're breaking protocol. I'm so very sorry. He said, what is the protocol? You have to meet with the chief first. And I said, okay, how do I do that? He lives 2 blocks down, or 2 houses down. So I said, okay, can I just go there? How do I address him? Just like you talked to me. So then I drove 2 houses down and knocked on the door of this guy's house. I stood a little bit, shaking outside, and then Chief Tom Jonathan came out. He stood a few steps above me and looked down. I could see on his hands, he had the bear claws tattooed all the way up on his hands, and he sort of looked at me, and, he had also been informed of my presence there. So we talked for about 20 minutes. First, he was talking about what the settlers had done to them in a very, very articulate but expressive way, that they had had a lot of alcoholism that the settlers had brought in, but they also had religion. And there was a kind of a back and forth. He also wanted to hear about my other exploration, both in the Amazon and so forth. So about after 20 minutes, he said, we have a meeting tonight, and I would like to invite you. I said, okay. So then that evening, they invited me to a group meeting with several of the members of the Sioux Nation. And it was sort of the kickoff for this last year's investigation. So at the meeting, they explained to me that all their knowledge is through oral history. So basically, that's how they deliver information. They don't have anything visual. So they actually were asking about, how can we create mappings of our migration, our history? They wanted to use that in their local school. There's a Tuscarora school. So I said, I'll help you with that. Like, we will create a whole storyline and visualizing of this, but we will work with you guys over the last year. So then me and my students would have Zoom sessions with them, explain their storyline. So for about 1,500 years ago, they were all here. And then the Tuscarora, they actually migrated to the Mississippi and then down to North Carolina. And they were in North Carolina for about 800 years before they came back to New York. And that story they wanted to visualize. So there was a give and take. So as we helped them with creating this storyline, they also helped us understanding their philosophy and their architecture. The main thing in Haudenosaunee philosophy is the 7-generation principle, basically. And this is the chief's wife, Angela Jonathan, and this is their historian, Vince Shefford. So these are taken from Zoom session we've had. So basically, the 7-generation philosophy is that you always have to think 7 generations out in the future. Whatever you do, you have to think that far out. So it's very different than obviously how we are raised, where we barely think 1 generation out. So this affects both forward and backwards. This is a statement from Vince. So he said, we didn't force the environment to give us more and more and more by staying in one spot. We moved and took what was naturally there. We moved with the rhythm of nature, and we still do to this day. So the 6 nations are among them the Tuscarora, and here is the Longhouse. The Longhouse fits max 150 people, usually between 100 to 150 people. It's very interesting. If you do sociological and anthropological studies, this is sort of defining moment of when, if you go beyond that you don't have a relationship anymore. Like, this is sort of the max you can maintain a close relationship to somebody. They had found out about this 1,000 years ago, but now sociology is saying, your personal community is max about that. That's sort of the maximum, but they had already figured out that. So basically, if they increase their population, they chop off the house, they make a new one. So they have this sort of knowledge of this. So what's also important to understand is their whole society structure is matrilinear. So it's all run by women, even though the chiefs are men, but the chiefs are selected by the women. So basically within, the family unit, they make up a clan. And I met, Tom Jonathan, he was chief of the Bear Clan. So that was his clan. And then within that, you have the next layer, right, which is the nation. So they kind of go up. And within the simplicity of this longhouse, traditionally, they would all live in the same house. No longer, but this is how it is. Today, it's more for religious practice, spiritual practices. One interesting thing we learned quickly was that we got to talk to Clifford Jacobs, who is a Columbia student, but grew up on a reservation. And he told us about some of the spatial implications that there would be living on a reservation. Like, until he was a teenager, he would rarely leave it. And it's almost like there would be an invisible border around the reservation. So when you walked across here, there was a different context. He said he had to go to high school on the outside of reservation. And in Tuscarora, it's actually rude to look somebody in the eyes while you're talking. So he would get in trouble in school talking to the teacher and looking away, right? And it's also rude to call somebody by their last name. So he wouldn't call the teacher Mrs. Smith, he'd just call her Brenda. So he said, you have to learn these sort of aspects as soon as you cross that invisible line. He was a wonderful guy, and we have sort of maintained a friendship. These are some of the student studies of the territorial implications of transforming land. I'm going through this a little bit more fast. So the next thing we did, also with the help of the Tuscarora, but now we also engaged with Navajos and Mohawk and a whole series of other people, was to figure out sort of the North American landscape. In indigenous cultures, they call it Turtle Island. That's basically Turtle Island. So what you see here is climatic, geographic, and a whole series of aspects that is the landscape of America. What was evident was that the indigenous pathways, the trail, were actually the footprint for the US highway system. So U.S. highway system is actually an appropriation of indigenous path. In turn, that was basically the indigenous people actually followed the animal path. So the animals were the first ones to create paths over thousands of years, and then the indigenous people followed those paths, and now we have the U.S. highway system. A big conversation was appropriation versus appreciation. In this map is sort of a depressing reminder of the repercussions of what has happened here. And all the small green dots are basically high school that have derogatory names for indigenous people. Their mascot is, a derogatory name. The national park, obviously, were some of the most holy sites, sacred sites for indigenous people. They were just taken over as sort of joy for the general American population. And then we know the stories about casinos, again, becoming these sort of appropriations. But Native American culture has had a lot of effect on modern American culture, and in various aspects. These are the Navajo code talkers who were used in World War II to trick the Germans and the Japanese. On a positive note, I call this appreciation. If you look at this, this came up about last summer when there was a lot of wildfires in California. California was basically losing control to all these fires, and the fire department couldn't keep up. They tried to enlist prisoners that couldn't help much either. So what they finally did was to go to the local indigenous population who had been doing controlled fire burning for about 1,000 years. So now the California system is using these indigenous ways of protecting themselves against fires. The blue dots, these are all done by my students at City College, but the blue dots are dam projects. The dams that we have today are very much in the same locations as was done by the indigenous people. So one of the more exploratory projects was done by 5 students. And what we try to do here is, I call it what if. What if the United States had not been colonized, so to speak? What was that if there was a clean slate? If this whole territory was now understood by settlers, what would happen? Going through and meeting with scholars in indigenous studies, these were sort of the 7 elements that was the most important. Reciprocity is one of them. Expansion and contraction, the considering of the collective, the understanding of interrelatedness, living with the land, not against the land. Like most of our, as we know it, is basically forcing on the land. And then there's creating for those who come after, which is the 7th generation. And then there's also practice regeneration. So these diagrams were sort of the baseline for this project that basically is the sort of the DNA for this architecture. So the baseline here is to understand, almost see the entire United States as a building ground. That's your site. You have the whole country, you're designing a whole country. These 4 locations are the 4 basically test studies. These are 4 cities that the students basically selected based on climatic differences and also sacred locations. And the first one was Snoqualmie, it's up close to Seattle. That location was very affected by, of course, climate, as the other ones were. So the architecture would have to reflect that. It's also next to the Snoqualmie waterfall, which has a lot of religious meaning to the indigenous people. So in this case, the architecture would have to sort of mitigate the weather condition, both the different seasons, but also relate to the waterfall. Here in Taos in New Mexico, it was more about the desert climate and how you dealt with this, but also a lot about astrology. So in this case, like talking to indigenous scholars, we found out that everything is part of your world if you're indigenous. So you can even a rock has a life of sorts, right? And this scholar we talked to, Mary Churchill up here, she knows indigenous people who have even been married to a star, like astrologically. So it's a very different kind of worldview. This one here is this is on the Mississippi River, and you can see here in this case it's also working with flooding, and we try to sort of invent these sort of community centers that would both have growth year round and so forth. This is down by Louisiana, which is actually my next site for my next study next year. But this is the end of Mississippi River, and the area here, of course, is very, very affected by climatic changes right now. But there's a very rich, indigenous population here because the ocean around there is so rich with fish. So in this case, they're trying to invent an architecture that could basically ventilate itself. These projects were done, mind you, like in a couple of months. Like it was all about sort of the DNA, the theoretical backup. So the conclusion with this is, let it change you. It's important not to appropriate indigenous cultures, but I think these values are human values, and we don't have to put on feathers and take Indian names and stuff like that. I really think that there needs to be new process of indigenization, of reconnecting to land and place, and that these values are important for the survival of planets. So another project that is ongoing here is that we began to invent an indigenous tool for, if you are indigenous, we have a website now that we launched that if you're curious about land claims for your nation, you can go onto this website, and we have a whole series of both background history. We have case studies of these various nations that have won land, the ones that are still not wanted. So this is sort of, I would say, the more activist part of my, trajectory. So the last project I'll talk about is quite different, but I think, it can learn from what we just have heard about here. And that is sort of a fascination I have with the future of our world, but rooted in current challenges. So this is the cover of the book that hasn't come out yet, but this is sort of the beginning of it. And a lot of it I'm basing in a bit dramatic, climatic and ecological collapse. So, and even I would say social collapse. So one of my main commentary here is land coverage. The global coverage, I think, is one of the biggest threats to our population and our world. And probably my biggest fear is suburbia. I have an intrinsic fear of suburbia, where you just see huge stretches of land taken over very few people. So the book is set up as a manual, almost like a catalog of how to approach it. We have a test study here. This was also done with graduate students at City College, but a few years ago. So the test study was done in Lower Manhattan between the Williamsburg Bridge and it's a housing project called Baruch Houses. This site was, selected as not as necessarily as a critique of the housing project, but more as a commentary on this particular site. It's 30 acres. There's 5,300 people living there, but half the site was flooded during Sandy. It's a site that needs attention. The housing stock is also deteriorating, but this was a site we thought could be an argument. So we started by analyzing entire New York City and basically the makeup of it. So when we had the volumes of these things here, we could begin to create another city within a city. This project is basically a building in one city. So we try to figure out how tall will this thing here be. In this case here, I think we came up with we had to do it for 25,000 people. So in this case here, this would be basically 3 times the height of the World Trade Center. So obviously it would have consequences. This is the current site, and the 3 different case studies were done by 4 or 5 students in each group. One we called Elevate, Stack, and so forth. And this is the first approach, which basically spreads out into the East River. And the building looks something like this, with basically almost an idea of retaking real estate by building these platforms up in air that would create these gardens up high. The next 2 here, or next to each other here, one would be Stack, and these are basically built as community volume. Each of these boxes at HVL were basically, I think, that 500 people. Like a community would be made out of about 3,000 people. So here we go back to almost the indigenous studies of sizes of when a community will actually work. We worked a lot with rewilding, like trying to get nature into these structures. And then the final one really parametrically worked with these sizes. So you can see the current Manhattan size versus the proposed sizes. So we could sort of massage these things here and create a building that would take form according to that. So this building looked like this. And then the last thing I'll do is I'm going to just show you a brief movie, which is about this last project here. It's basically a little appetizer for the book. Sort of a new way of.
And now we're heading back towards where we live, which the inevitable we didn't think was going to happen. starting to happen.
2020 has tied with 2016 as the world's warmest year on record.
Ice in the Arctic is melting at an alarming rate.
The largest fire in state history. Massive fires, already among the worst in that country's history.
Fire-scorched land couldn't hold rain.
There are reports from New Orleans of people trapped in buildings that have come down around them.
Hurricane Sandy turning the streets of New York into something more like the canals of Venice.
This is just unbelievable. We're downtown by the towers.
City public housing are pleading for help as they are living without gas or electricity.
Today we don't have hot water at all.
We had a barn in the middle, pretty much, of the subdivision.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Martin. Fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of a wide journey.
It's
I thought they had
incredible.
yeah.
It's incredible. There is a lot to unpack and discuss and critique here in this very dense research that starts from the past and the roots and extends into the future. And I especially appreciate the what if question. I think this resonates very much with the studio that we're teaching here at T-Space, starting as a thought experiment, really. So what if then you have a certain visual and design as the answer of the speculation, of this hypothesis. I would like to open it up to our panelists as well as the audience. You can access the Q&A. Our panelists can access the Q&A. And Martin, if you need a little bit more time for our panelists, I can take the first question. Is that okay?
Yeah, well, you can answer. You can ask the questions, right?
Yes, I'm going to read this out loud so everybody can, because not everybody can see it. In your presentation, Andre Silva is asking, you show how certain cultural or indigenous systems comply within the community in order to perform its functions. Do you believe those principles can apply to the present society? What impact would the US have if after colonization, these ways of living were implemented? And would we call it appropriation or appreciation?
That's a great question. And I think there's so much to learn from the indigenous people I've worked with. Like I would say this last year, going through pandemic and so forth, it has still been the most sort of intensely inspirational experience I've had with research. And I think I've also found over the years that, the direct conversation with your target, your topic, the people is the only way to figure this out. We met with at least 10 indigenous people, sometimes multiple times, and had multiple discussions. There was a whole initial layers of respect that had to be sort of resolved. Just the whole language was, they were nervous about us, we were nervous about them. It's a very, very, even though you feel you're within the same territory. But I would say one of the major things is the 7 generation principle. The fact that you are thinking 7 generations out in the future. That's something we could learn so much from. Like when we see politicians, not even thinking about their own grandchildren, like that, the whole oil industry and so forth, right? They're completely baffled. When you talk to them, they're just shaking their heads. Like they find it so bizarre that people don't understand how important our environment is. So I think we are going in this direction, but they're a big corporation. There's a lot of greed and so forth that needs to be in check before things can really happen. I think things are getting a bit better now, but I certainly think, there are 574 registered nations in North America, Turtle Island, and there are many more that are not federally recognized. They're not the same. They're all very different, and they see themselves as different. There are cultural groups that are similar, and I think that there's so much to learn from the various nations. In my kind of investigation I see this in architecture as a possibility to sort of get ideas thinking out of the box, that there is a possibility for cross-pollination, that you don't always have to go into the architecture library and get your inspiration, but there are these things out there close to us that have huge possibilities. And I think, me and the students over the last year have all felt that. So there were students that tried to build a longhouse for New York City, which was a very interesting conversation to figure out how can you apply that. There are parts of New York City that actually have a larger indigenous population than others. They're a part of the city that might apply more to this model because it also applies to intergenerational relationships, much more about families and so forth, right? So I think it could have huge positive consequences if you were to listen more to the indigenous population.
Thank you, Martin. Sorry. Thank you, Martin, so much for your talk. It was like, it spurred the imagination, and we kind of witnessed the power of architecture to show imaginaries. First, the post-colonial indigenous imaginary, and then, let's say, the urban future imaginary. And that's, I really see the power of architecture in that realm. I wonder also, beyond simply making an image and to concretize what this imaginary looks like, do you also do research in terms of the pragmatics of a building project, in terms of flows of capital? How is this going to get built? What is the policy that needs to change to be able to build in this kinds of way? Or do you think that this is not necessarily within the scope of responsibility of the kind of work that you're doing in terms of making these imaginaries present and visible?
No, I certainly think that the speculative work needs to be grounded in real issues. I don't think it's just, creating another Blade Runner. I think that this is about taking current issues, climate change and social revolt and so forth, like people being very dissatisfied, and try to charge them and funnel them into architecture. So, for example, taking this particular case study site in New York City, a housing project, it's definitely a politically charged thing, because these are low-income housing, and they're, proposing them to be rehoused is already a charged idea. But the idea here was that, how does it both work financially, and how does it also create a different, more positive aspect for these people living there? So I see New York, actually, I love New York City, but it's also a series of ghettos. And I don't mean poor ghettos, I mean rich ghettos also. I mean, Tribeca is a ghetto, right? So there are ghettos throughout cities, globalized cities. And I think it's a bit sad that they're so segregated, particularly social, financially. So this project, we had a whole topic, we called it multiplicity, but it also investigated social mixing. I don't really like that term, but how do different types of people live together under the same roof, right? So there are political ideas in New York City with housing that sort of demands and give tax credits for new housing going up. So usually it's a 20% idea, where basically 20% of your housing will have to be for low-income housing, right? Developers, of course, are very good at finding loopholes to get around this, right? So you have to figure out first off, the setup of how you build, whether the developer has a long-term involvement or not. If they don't have a long-term involvement, it gets even more tricky, because then at that point, it's just about having financial gain immediately. So what happened in New York housing was, at first, when the idea of trying to house people with low-income housing was that this tax credit was, floated out there, and then these developers would build cheap housing in South Bronx and then expensive housing in Manhattan, and then just relocate types of, huge areas of the population, right? Then later on, it was demanded that this housing has to be in the same building. So then the developers came up with this A and B door, right? So the B door would be for the poor people and A for the rich people, right? Now you can't do that anymore. So, the developers keep trying to find these loopholes, and I think we just have to be intelligent in how we deal with this.
I'm interested in your work almost as a sort of anthropologist, as you research and sort of communicate with these communities of Native Americans. I'm curious as to how sort of the architecture student can engage with these practices, and how it can make its way through the architecture pedagogy, because I think for me personally, and I think maybe others, architects, my architecture education has been very sort of pragmatic and focused on architecture itself and on its own geometry. And I'm wondering how you approach this idea of trying to become an anthropologist and also an advocate.
It's a good question. I think I've been teaching about 10 years at Spitzer School of Architecture. I've taught at other schools too. And I think the these things were always triggering questions to myself. So the first time I went to the Amazon and stayed with a shore population is 20 years ago. So these stories, they sort of accumulate. So when I finally met the Stixgard last summer, I had to tell that story. So you build it over time. You begin to build these things, and don't always think that it has to be, again, the architectural library or the architectural studio. It's not just about form, right? I think when you begin to cross-pollinate your information bank, that's when it gets really exciting. I think I do my commercial work. I do, housing and buildings and civic and so forth. And I love a good design. It's not about that, but it's like this thing here has a larger effect. Like this website we now have for Indigenous people, I'm very proud of because it can actually make a real change. And I have worked with mass incarceration. I did a whole studio on that also. And again, a topic that is, not particularly seen as something you would do in architecture school, but actually students seem to really engage with this, and it seems to resonate in a different way. I feel like a huge part of the architecture education is very antiquated. That I think there's possibilities within the architecture education beyond what we have sort of imagined and beyond what I was taught. I think there are these, but it's sort of, you have to sort of step out of your comfort zone and begin to investigate these things here. Working with Indigenous people is a whole other thing, and it's a lot about respect. And you said Native American. It's actually, many feel that's disrespectful because they're not American. If you've noticed, I have an accent. So I'm from Denmark, and I think I don't know why. I think it helped a little bit with the Tuscaroras that I had an accent. I don't know why, because Denmark has also colonized and so forth, right? But I was not American. After being in this conversation with Tuscarora for about an hour and a half, this amazing woman, Wendy, one I really admire, she stood up and she said to me, "You've used the word tribe the last hour and a half." I said, "Yeah." I said, "We don't like it. We do not like it. We find it disrespectful. We are not a tribe. We're a nation. We're people." So I had to apologize, right? Like, you have to immediately apologize. All the Indigenous people I met with are extremely honest and direct. So I told her, because you told me this, now I can tell these students what you have taught me. But this is, again, there are many, many nations. Some nations I have talked to use tribe about themselves. So, it's a fine balance, and it's a very exciting one to sort of engage with.
Not to continue, but just to add on to that, I think the sort of central element is just to be sensitive and just to hear, just to listen. I was really struck by that picture you put up of the suburb, and you quickly mentioned that suburbs sort of freak you out, and they definitely freak me out too. I live in Maryland, and here, you hear every 2 years there's some big plot of land just bought up, and then these massive, sort of mega mansions are just plopped up next to each other. They all look identical. And I think the architect in me has this sort of confusion, because I'm sensitive to design, as everyone here is. But I always wonder, how would anybody want to live in the house that's identical to their neighbor and that's 2 feet apart? How do you feel that the architect should sort of reinvigorate the public imagination about the suburb, and like how, their expectations? Because I fear that there's not enough pressure put on the developers to innovate, to make more energy efficient houses, for example, or more unique architecture.
I think that we haven't seen the end of these climatic crisis consequences. And I don't think that until we see something even more severe, that things will really begin to happen. I think that's the problem, that money talks, more than anything else. And there is a population that they're desired this type of housing. It's their dream to have this large house. They don't care that there's thousands of the same one next to them. They don't see living in New York City, for example, as an attractive thing. It's almost a very tiny part of America that can even enjoy that. I love it, but it's also sort of a skill. There's a certain stress level. I think it's wonderful, but like, if you're not used to it, it's a different thing. But I think that in the future, I could imagine that we would just have these very, very large, very, very dense cities. But they need to be designed so they're also comfortable. They need to have the same kind of comfort that a suburbia can kind of give you, which is very much about nature, rewilding. So certain countries around the world have been better at implementing this notion of rewilding, putting nature into the architecture, right? So I think you're right. I think it's a political thing, basically. It has to be much more strong-willed to sort of create a change.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to add on, I live in rural, sort of Western Pennsylvania. So similarly to Jack, I sort of see these developments like erupting everywhere. And it is sort of alarming, they're like so antithetical to that idea of the 7th-generation philosophy, and that they're like these paper houses essentially. And I guess just as a synthesis, maybe not really a question, but like a synthesis to Jack and Alexander's questions, I'm sort of interested in how like bringing these topics into architectural education sort of gives us an agency again to in the built world, we've sort of lost a lot of that agency. So I think some kind of architectural education model in which we sort of are working alongside in academia with people with an architectural education, but are working in the policy or in sort of as contractors and things like that. So I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and how you actually like infuse this like long, slow process of making equitable sort of building choices into the academia, which is sort of a shorter time span.
It's a very good point. And I think earlier I mentioned sort of this notion of empathy. I feel like that the topic you're engaged with, you have to meet with the people who are actually engaged with it. Like we shouldn't design in a vacuum. And it happens way too much in architecture school. So I think, when I worked with the prison system, I actually got a tour of a maximum security prison with my students, which was incredibly depressing and heartbreaking, but it transformed everyone's view right there, right? We also work with former inmates and so forth, right? So that's one end of the scale. But then there's also a whole series of experts that are not educated in architecture, but in all kinds of other disciplines that are excited to challenge and to discuss with. So for the indigenous studies, we also met with Professor Hilary Brown, who is one of the foremost professors in sustainability. So she obviously has sort of a more modern take on some of these indigenous strategies, but it was very fascinating to begin to combine these new technologies with these ancient strategies, right?
There was a handful of words in your presentation that really struck me. Indigenization or re-indigenization as a path forward, and considering like your proposal for City X is essentially like a higher density than we have in cities now to allow to give back land to nature, and rewilding and that concept. And one of the things that I've lived most of my life in smaller towns in the Northwest, and the sprawl, like you almost can't recognize the difference between a suburb of a city and a small city. That they've kind of turned the same. And I live in Boise, Idaho now. And while the city is growing very quickly, the areas around it are growing 10 times as fast as these gated neighborhood sprawl, suburban sprawl. It's very depressing. But the thing that I see is the poverty in small towns is so much associated with the lack of density, because you have people that get paid less because they're in a small town because it's supposed to be cheaper to live there, but then they're spread out farther, so they have to have more transportation expenses, and there's less services available to maintain these things. So it's like more and more expenses are put on people that don't live in dense societies. And so I started thinking of like, can we densify rural America? Can we do that so that those areas that already have a lot more natural ground can keep it?
I think it's a wonderful idea. I really enjoyed that commentary, and I have traveled around the States. I also used to live in Seattle. It's a bigger city, but but seeing kind of the anonymous nature of a lot of America, just you can't really tell whether you're in Montana or Idaho or wherever you are, right? It's the same sort of strip mall sort of fabric and suburbia, right? Same houses. So I think that I think architects can come up with ideas to energize this problem. Basically, I think that that's actually a really interesting investigation. So I'm more tackling the bigger city as sort of this new possibility. But I think your argument for the poverty in small cities is another argument for moving to the big cities. But there should also be resolution ideas for the smaller towns and how we can invigorate those. For sure, I think it's a really interesting thought.
Lots of interesting directions for this conversation. Can we take one question from the chat?
Yeah.
By Ali Hocken. Ali is asking, I am reminded of a European history fascinated with the American expansion west. The sense of other worlds begins perhaps from the fictions like those of Jules Verne and extending to Tintin, but also these early illustrated novellas with names like Red Kid and Tomahawk. While we would look at these now as xenophobic and racist, I wonder if this might speak of the Native American struggle as one not limited to the US. Do you think there is such a trajectory, and what are its implications globally?
It's a good question, Ali. I think that there are similarities to the European storyline. I think that it runs both parallel and in a different direction. It's a much more obviously modern condition here. And the colonization of European countries is still affecting large parts of the world. I think I recently came up with a strange thing about my country, because my country were also involved in lots of very, very negative things in the earlier days. And so basically Denmark, has Greenland under their crown. So Denmark essentially is the biggest country in Europe, even though it's the smallest when you look at a map, but we also have Greenland. There's an Inuit population of about 50,000 people there. And a lot of them are mixed with Danish people. And there's obviously a colonial aspect to this, but what has come up was that there's been Inuit people there for 4,000 to 5,000 years. They came over from Canada and migrated into Greenland and settled there. Most of those disappeared or died. And the last wave, the Inuit people who are there today, they came in about year 1000. But at that point, the Vikings had already settled there. So the people from Scandinavia had already created towns there. And the Inuit population coming in, they actually came after. So I don't know, it's sort of a strange story of what is the colonial aspect of this. I think that there's so many layers of complexity to this. And I think that we need to also sort of do an investigation of Africa and the conditions there, right? Have huge effect, because have so many resources, so many incredible things, but it's so affected by European colonialism. Thank you.
Martin, a few more questions coming in. Some commentary by Kieran Waters. I think this goes back to the conversation with the suburban. Unfortunately, the McMansion subdivisions are driven by the realtors. As in a residents transported from New York City to the suburbs of Connecticut, the cookie cutter colonial cells. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that. And one more question, which native nations do you choose to focus on? From your lecture, it seems as if the longhouse structure anchored the research to this area, but do you see this research expanding on other nations within the state or outside of the state. Specifically, the Shinnecock Reservation has been in the news lately for the report and is located directly adjacent to suburban communities. Additionally, if you can hold up this information, additionally, with your experience in gallery spaces, do you see yourself turning this into an exhibit designed and curated by Studio Stixgard?
That sounds like an amazing idea. Right now, I think I'm all working on a book. So over the last year, we accumulated at least 1,000 pages of research. And we have basically a transcript for every single interview we did. And like, you know, I'm not limited to the Haudenosaunee, the Tuscarora, but they have become my friends over this last year. And I would say at the end of this research, I've spent a lot of time sharing our research with them. So, you know, giving them the mappings that we created for them so they can use that in the educational system. That's one way of giving back. But it's somehow they took me in, and I really appreciate that. But I would love to engage with other nations across the country. It's not that this is my sort of specialty, but I think this is something I can never let go again. It's just, I've already been involved with it for so many years, but this last year has just been sort of particularly potent. So I think the Shinnecock situation is also very much worth investigating. And I think at the final review a few months ago here, there were several of the reviewers that said that this indigenous studies should be a studio project for all students in America. Like the way indigenous culture is taught in America is, it's pretty horrific. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she was learning about the Napi in Manhattan, where we are from. But the way it was taught was that they had disappeared 100 years ago. Like, so when I said I went up to visit the Tuscarora, she said, "What? They're still alive?" I said, "Yeah, I mean, there are, of course." And so the kids are being taught that this is sort of this historic phenomenon that doesn't exist anymore. And I think it would be good that, of course, that was revised a bit at the early age. But I think in architecture school, I think it would be really important to almost have a studio that would engage with this. And I'm saying this is not just to learn the facts, but it's also to learn some of the methods, the tools, the 7th-generation principle. Like the idea of the longhouse is not the idea of a house with this shape and form, but it's much more philosophical strategy, right, for architecture.
About your upcoming book, Martin, there is a question: when do you anticipate having your book available, and where could we go find it?
It's supposed to be published through Spitzer School of Architecture, and we are aiming to get it published in the fall. That's the goal right now. There's still some editing and so forth. It's a long process. I worked on it for 3 years. So, but I think things are coming together now. And you can see that was one of the reasons why we did the movie, was a sort of an appetizer for the book. And also kind of, we all have learned through this sort of COVID 2020 and trying to find new strategies of presenting work, right? So that was one method.
Yes, and when our residents here are also going to be experimenting with moving image. And I know, Reggie, you have a question. I'll come back to in a second. So I was just, I mean, I think it's a fascinating way to communicate with moving image. We were referencing La Jetée from Chris Marker, the short film, and the reason I'm bringing this up is that in that film, as well as different other ways of representation, there seems to be these gaps, right? That there is this, not everything is known, and that we fill this in with the imagination. So I was wondering, in terms of representation techniques that you're using, mapping, rendering, visualizing this information, is there a way, or are you, I mean, I know on one hand, mapping is complex for different reasons because you're overlaying information. On the other hand, renderings and three-dimensional visualizations can be challenging, where you want to present the future or a question about the future, yet can we maybe explore ways, or have explored ways, where the representation still includes gaps, where the information is not fully given to us, but we are allowed to fill in those gaps with our imagination. Does that make sense? What has been your experience with the presentation so far?
My experience has been that it's definitely a longer process than you expect. It's not easy to just put a movie together. And over the last year and a half, that has been sort of my demand for most of my students, that this is the final presentation. It's a really, really good training to be more articulate and get more concise. So a project will be presented in 10 minutes. That's it. So they might have research for an hour conversation afterwards. So they're doing kind of a book on the side, and then the movie is what's going to carry the day, basically. And for that, you know, developing a storyline, almost like you are a movie director, is essential. You have to set the stage. You have to figure out what is the issue, what's the problem. Like, you don't go straight into the problem. You need to sort of frame the background and make it interesting. Another thing that people seem to, you know, have a hard time understanding is the notion of sound. Sound is incredibly important. You can't be, you know, whispering. The music you pick has to jive with the images and so forth. So there's a whole kind of compositional kind of aspect to creating a movie. So, you know, I would work with students over weeks, like, and there would be first kind of like the building blocks, and then we would try to find like what is sort of the main kind of metabolism of this. And I think in terms of these gaps, sometimes the gaps are okay, but there has to be some sort of a seamlessness experience for the viewer. So you don't want it to be choppy. You want to have sort of, even like mentally, you want to understand the argument, right? And showing drawings, you also don't want to show a drawing. You don't need to show the entire drawing. You can see in the movie that we panned over drawing. Like, it's nice sometimes, but it's not a PowerPoint presentation. You're not in person. It's a different thing. People are viewing it on a screen. And I think you want to do it efficient. You don't want to have a 30-minute video. Like, nobody's going to want to watch it, right? So.
A little follow-up on that. So do you think that in general the role of the architect has changed? If you think 100 years ago, our tools were a pencil and colored textures to make maybe at most a perspective, but maybe the architect communicated through plan and section. And now we have all these media at our disposal. Where do we focus our attention, and how do we, because you cannot flesh out every single detail of some of those massive buildings that you conducted in your studio, of course, and so we need to limit our attention. So do you think that in general the role of the architect has changed?
I think it's changed massively, but I think it's a huge and exciting aspect to our profession. I think I still draw every day. Like, you know, I came out of the Royal Academy and I just like to hand draw all my sketches. All my initial ideas come out of that. Even these sort of crazy exploration might start with a sketch. But and I also do like paper models. Paper models do something that you cannot do in the computer.
Like the ones behind you.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Like the ones behind me. Yeah, these are all exploration.
And the ones behind Alexander too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the paper model really forces you into a certain mode that is very different than you would explore in the computer. I think the computer, I love the computer. Like, you know, most of my work is developing computer, but I think you're missing something if you don't do the paper model. You have a possibility of just getting the project so much more interesting by exploring it in a paper model or in another type model. And these are just, you know, some of the more standard formats of, you know, working with architecture. So I think the movie is another type, right? So I think some people begin to work with linguistics and so forth. There are all kinds of approaches to developing architecture.
This is my question before this whole conversation linked to it, and it's the idea of presentation, but more of like a communication tool for these ideas to get out into the broader public. When you told the story of your meeting where you had been using the word tribe, and then one of the members came up and said, you know, that's a disrespectful word for us. We use the word nation. And then your comment is, well, now I can tell all of my students, and then they can tell everyone else. You know, it's like this exponential effect. But I see how so much of what I have learned since I came back to grad school to pursue architecture, I never knew before. It's all available through these isolated conversations between architects, sociologists, like, you know, it's all academic. And like we had a wonderful presentation with Yolanda Daniels yesterday, and her information, like how does that, like, important history and reaction to all of the retelling of history, honest history, like how does that inform us now, for people that don't have any connection with the industry of the built environment, they don't have any connection with academia? How do we communicate that to them? I mean, do we need to start making blockbuster films, or like, do we need an Instagram invasion, or like, how does this work? Like, you know, we're in this period where our information is like, algorithms specifically isolate us into bubbles. And how do we break that when we're already in a bubble?
Yeah, that's sort of a matrix question, huh? I think it's a fascinating question. I would say, you know, beginning to explore AI and architecture, you know, is probably the next sort of territory. And I think how this is going to unfold is uncertain. It's not that there's sort of a strategy now for us to say, you know, we have to make blockbuster movies. And also, maybe it's not interesting to reach the general public. Like maybe, you know, there are certain things that it's not about sort of this popularity, getting the most Instagram hits, right? But that is more about like your investigation and how it affects a group of people, right? That's, I think, so when I work with Indigenous people, like that's my thing. It's, you know, me, my students, and the Indigenous population, and that's sufficient. Like if they want to have publicity, yeah, you know, if that helped them, like the Shinnecock right now can probably, you know, get some guided positive publicity, right? Because they're all engaged with the Hamptons community, who are very wealthy and trying to screw them over, basically, right?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of like the ripple effect, you know, like if we can find a way to like let one person know that has another audience, and then that person's audience then can translate that information to their various networks. And I think that's more what my interest is. I'm not thinking that architects need to become, you know, public speakers at that level. Like I'm thinking that, like, how do we, I mean, this, maybe my thoughts are coming back to like the role of architecture, and, you know, reading about the lives of architects in like the early 20th century that were involved with these massive like redevelopment programs. Like Louis Kahn was involved with housing in Pennsylvania. And, you know, like before that, Frank Lloyd Wright was involved with the various like policy level things in society, how we develop and expand the built environment. But we're so much just building for the 1% at this point that we don't have that role anymore. We're just like complete servants and not leaders.
I agree with you. And I think that this is why, you know, through academia and other means, you can begin to take a more sort of activist role. So creating, for example, this website is helpful. Like last spring, I did another study with graduate students for migrants coming through Mexico. And we went to what Trump called the second wall. It's a wall or border demarcation between Mexico and Guatemala. So we went there, me and Professor Ali Hocek, with about 20 graduate students, and interviewed the migrants coming across the border there, and try to find ways to assist them in various ways. So it's a complete chaos down there. It's a militarized zone. But one of the groups I work with, we developed also a website, but it was basically a live website that would, it's also online. It's called mira.org, M-I-R-A. And it basically helps a migrant crossing the border into Mexico navigate his way or her way all the way up to the US border. It's, of course, infested with cartels and so forth, right? So this will give live data if somebody has been killed by a cartel or fallen off a train and so forth, right? So, you can use, architect is definitely not just a building, and you have a lot more say than you might think. And I think academia in the kind of Western Hemisphere has been very good at sort of exploring these other sort of terrains. So I would say that a lot of us do buildings for wealthy people, the 1%, and it feels a bit strange sometimes. I agree with you.
Max, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Just to totally commend you on rooting your work in Indigenous community. I got really excited. We chatted briefly before, but I got really excited about when you mentioned that and when that was going to be part of the work. That's the school I go to is totally based on Indigenous precedents and all of that here in Canada. And just the climate right now and what's going on in Canada regarding all residential schools and all these things that are coming up. So I just wanted to, I got really excited about that, and I'm really excited for where the work goes. Yeah.
Thank you, Max. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I think we can wrap it up here. I would love to keep going with this conversation. And it has so many different directions, turning research into design, into activism. It has been very interesting and a lot to unpack here. Thank you for this very, very fruitful conversation, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome to join our final reviews, where we see our residents' thought experiments. These are the what ifs of our residents, and that's for a much smaller design, not at an urban scale, but certainly it can draw from different aspects in urban life as well. So if our audience is also invited to that review, we will put links in the chat, and you can find more information on our website. And on Friday, we'll switch our attention to Spain. We'll go to, we'll have a lecture by Alberto Campo Baeza, a completely different approach. So it has been very interesting to hear from you and allow for such a critique and conversation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.